Good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm Zach Myers with the Center for Dairy Excellence. Thank you for taking the time to join our Protecting Your Profits webinar today. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box by clicking on the chat box at the bottom of your screen and type your question. My goal today is to provide an overview of the current dairy market and to review risk management opportunities. This is all public information, and while I may express some opinions, these are not recommendations. So with that, we'll keep the same agenda as we normally have. I'm going to try to run through my portion a little bit quicker so we can get Dr. Wolf as much time as possible for his review of federal milk marketing order reforms and sort of where we are in the process currently and what's hopefully going to happen or what may happen going forward. At 19.8 billion pounds, U.S. milk production was up about 0.5% compared to March of last year. U.S. cow numbers were up 31,000 head to 9.435 million. And this is up about 6,000 head compared to February's revised numbers. Milk production per cow was basically flat, up just 0.1% at 2,099 pounds compared to last year. Per cow compared to last year. And Pennsylvania cow numbers are down about 1,000 from last year and equal to February and to 466,000 head, which is also the third consecutive month that Pennsylvania has been able to maintain the same herd size. Pennsylvania milk output per cow, like the U.S., was basically flat, up 1 pound for the month at 1,870 pounds per cow. Total production was also basically flat at 871 million pounds, just down 0.2% year over year, or about 2 million pounds less. With cow cow prices up and milk price down, 8,900 more cows went to beef markets through February than did 1 year ago, for a total of just over 306,000 dairy cows. Butter at 292.7 million pounds were up about 3.5%. At 1.46 billion pounds, cheese stocks were basically flat, but down almost 0.5%. Non-fat dry milk at 310 million pounds was up in February about 7.5%. On the dairy product price side, at $2.38 per pound, March butter price is 42 cents less than last year. The global dairy trade and EU butter price are both slightly lower than the U.S. price. Cheese price is 25 cents less than last year at $1.97, but 13 cents more than the global dairy trade at $1.84. And unfortunately, the site I use for the average EU cheese price is not updated since last month, so I don't have an EU price to compare that to at this time. At $1.17 per pound, non-fat dry milk is 68 cents less than last year, but similar to the GDT price and EU price at $1.24 and $1.18, respectively. You will see the net effect of these lower prices on exports in a couple of slides when we look at the disappearance data that I typically report. On the product production side, butter and cheese and non-fat dry milk were all up slightly to a little more significant on the non-fat dry milk side at 7.5%. And then now to the demand side of things, butter, 164 million pounds of butter disappeared during the month of February. This is 13% more year over year, but that was driven by a 17% increase in domestic usage because due to our higher butter price, partly due to the higher butter price, exports were down 32% compared to a year ago. Domestic usage of butter accounted for 95% of the disappearance in February. Total cheese, which is American style plus other style cheese, at 1.131 billion pounds of disappearance, was up a little bit year over year. Again, this was driven by domestic usage with a 3% increase, while exports were basically flat but down about 0.1%. And just like butter, domestic usage accounts for the majority of disappearance in February. And on the non-fat dry milk, skim milk powder, 175 million pounds of these powder products disappeared. This is down 7.6%, with a lot with that coming from exports down 0.5%, and domestic usage was actually up 10%. But since exports account for the biggest part of powder disappearance, this overwhelmed the ability of domestic usage increase to remain positive, and so non-fat dry milk and skim milk powder disappearance was down. Moving to the class 3 and class 4 prices based on April 24th closing prices. Class 3, where the blue line, drops nearly $2 from $18.63 this month to $16.89 in May, and then improves into the mid-19s by November before dropping over $2 in December and into the spring of next year. At $18.69, the 12-month average class 3 milk price is 34 cents less than last month, and just 71 cents more than the 5-year rolling average of $17.98, which is represented by the red line there on the graph. Class 4 milk price, or the green line, hits its low next month at $17.86 and steadily improves and approaches the 1950s by the end of the year before tapering off to $19 by next spring. At $18.82 a hundredweight, the 12-month price is 28 cents. Average price is 28 cents higher than last month, and still $1.59 more than the 5-year average of $17.23, which is represented by the purple line there on your graph. February exports as a total, over 177,000 million metric tons of milk solids equivalents were exported in February. Much slower growth on an MSE basis compared to previous month at just 0.8% increase year over year. And for the first time in more than 2 years, export value was actually down year over year, down by 3%, ending the month at an estimated $665.6 million. You already saw in an earlier slide that 3 of the major export categories were down. This means that exports from other categories drove the slight increase in year-over-year volume. That growth was driven primarily by lactose, which typically ranks as the 4th largest export category. Lactose exports grew by 32%, or by about 9,300 metric tons compared to a year ago. Whey protein concentrate 80 plus and milk protein concentrate both helped support with slight growth with positive gains compared to last year. So moving on to risk management. The February DMC margin was announced at $6.19 a hundredweight. This triggered a $3.31 indemnity at the maximum 950 coverage. This is equivalent to about $2,600 per 1 million pounds, or about $13,000 if an operation maxes out the 5 million pound cap. The February payment covers the remaining 3 cents per hundredweight of the annual premium that the January payment did not cover, and provides a net benefit of 23 cents per hundredweight for the year so far. Feed costs increased by 25 cents to $15.41, and the U.S. all milk price fell $1.50 to $21.60. The March margin will be announced this Friday after 3 o'clock. So looking at projections from this year, of course, this comes from the DMC online decision tool. Just highlight the circled there column. That's the DMC margin forecast for the rest of the year. Of course, January and February are actual margins, and March through December are projected. So as you see there, through October, DMC is expected, at least based on today's market, to trigger indemnities. If these margins became reality, DMC is projected to provide a net benefit of about $1.79 a hundredweight for the year. Dairy revenue protection, 100% class 3, 95% price protected floors could be set from a low of $17.58 in Q3 of 2024 to a high of $18.44 in Q4 of 2023. for an average price of 39 cents a hundredweight. And these prices are based off of 424 closing prices. On the class 4 side, floors could have been set from a low of 17.56 per hundredweight in the second quarter of next year, up to 18.44 in the fourth quarter of this year, for an average cost of 44 cents per hundredweight, with third quarter 2024 policies not offered on the 24th. So with that ends my portion. I just want to quickly introduce Dr. Chris Wolf. Christopher Wolf is the E.V. Baker Professor of Ag Economics in the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University. He conducts research, extension, and teaching focusing on dairy markets and policy, farm business management, risk management, and farm animal welfare. Wolf is published widely in academic and industry outlets. Wolf's extension program stresses the effect of public policy on farm behavior and financial outcome, aiming to focus on issues of current and future importance to policymakers and industry decision makers. So with that, I will stop sharing, Dr. Wolf, and so you can share and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Zach. Is that working?
Let's see. It says, yep, it's working.
Okay, great. Well, I'm just trying to hide the meeting controls. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for having me here today, Zach. I appreciate the opportunity to talk. And it's nice to have you all online, and so we can all do this from all over the place. So today I want to talk a little bit about the Federal Milk Marketing Order reform, or if you prefer, modernization proposals and aspects, and where we're at. And I should, probably start this by saying that you're getting my perspective on this. And I have talked to people that are working on this. I know that there are people on this in the seminar today listening that maybe will be commenting or contributing here that are more inside baseball on a lot of these things than I am. So, I'm purely trying to look at the economics of this and, take it with a grain of salt. You're getting the wolf bias on this, or I try to be unbiased, but there's always those type of things. So for what that's worth, let's be off. So just as a reminder, I'm sure that you guys all recall this, but the Federal Milk Marketing Orders have been around for 85 years now. And the reason that we created them to begin with was that there were market conditions that were disorderly, right? So the primary objectives were to ensure orderly marketing, which means that the markets are functioning smoothly and predictably and have a reasonable cost. That when somebody goes to the store, they can find milk, and that farmers can find a home for their milk when they need to. Also, one of the stated objectives was price stability. I would argue that, it was kind of implied at that point in time that would result in an adequate price. So, if I was redoing it today, I would maybe say price adequacy rather than stability, because we certainly have had periods of time when the farm level, the price is very stable and not very adequate. Also, that people have adequate, wholesome supplies of fluid milk available, and that there's equitable returns to farmers. And I think that many of these concerns still apply today. So, I think there's certainly a reason to keep the Federal Milk Marketing Orders around, and that they play an important role. Whoops, hold on. There's my mouse. Sorry about that. Hold on, I hit end. My bad. Okay. It would be nice if this control thing would stop popping up. All right. So in order to do so, right, the primary instruments that the Federal Milk Marketing Orders have is that they classify milk based on end use into 4 classes and define minimum prices based on wholesale product prices, and working backwards from that point, at least for the last couple of decades, that they then pool the revenue across these classes for the federal milk marketing order in question to provide a weighted average blend price. And I think very importantly, one of the things that they do is they provide the auditing, the certification across the different participants in the order. And they provide a certain level of market information that benefits not just kind of the people that are participating in the marketing orders, which I think it does from a making agreements and understanding where everybody's at, but also there's a certain degree of public good in providing that market information that I think is really important and sometimes doesn't get the weight that it should. Now, from my perspective, the primary source of dissatisfaction with federal milk marketing orders in recent years and at the current time is that there's just not enough money to go around, which is related to some longer term trends. And we'll talk about that. And also that there's utilization and pooling issues, and they're really interrelated. I think we could draw some fences between those two sets of sources of dissatisfaction, but they really are related. So let's talk a bit about that before we get into the proposals. So this is class 1 quantity. And so this is in millions of pounds. So, and I threw up all of the federal milk marketing orders on there. Primarily I'll focus on the Northeast. So for example, in 2000 in the Northeast, the class 1, the amount of milk that went into class 1 in the year 2000 in the Northeast milk marketing order was 10,512 million pounds, which is 10.5 billion pounds. And you can see kind of what was going on across all of the orders. Now, this is, again, just quantities. We'll talk about percentages in a moment. In the Northeast was the biggest amount by a significant margin, right? So the Mideast had 6.7 billion pounds and the Southeast had roughly 9 billion pounds. And in all total, it was about 46 billion pounds of milk that went into class 1. In 2010, in the Northeast, it's still 10.4 billion pounds. And across all orders, it's 45 billion pounds. So it's down a little bit, but not crazy, right? And then in 2021, we've dropped to 8.1 billion pounds and 42 billion pounds in total across the orders. So if we look at the bottom two rows there, the change from 2000 to 2021, so the entire period there, down roughly 22.5% in the Northeast, down 8.4% across all orders. And you can see down pretty big in the upper Midwest, in the Southeast and Pacific Northwest. But if we look then at the change that happened basically in the second half of that period, it's almost all of that change, right? So if you look at consumption over time and you look at per capita consumption of beverage milk, it really is startling how much, there was a long-term decline in per capita. And for many years, total consumption kind of was held up by the fact that we consistently had population growth, and we haven't had as much population growth in recent years. And I would argue that the demographics have changed in the population growth that we have had, which is contributing to the kind of total decline in beverage milk. But most of that decline in most of these areas, not all of them, but most of it in most of the areas really happened since 2010. So, before that, maybe there, and what does this relate back to? It relates back to where the value is in the order. So if we do the same, take a look at the same data, but we do it in terms of percentages. So again, the Northeast, 44% class 1 utilization in 2000, 43% in 2010, and down to 30% in 2021. So a 31.4% decline over that entire 22-year period, but 30 of that 31% happened in the second half of that 22-year period. And similarly, a little bit less in an aggregate sense, but we went from almost 40% utilization across all orders to down to 31%. And actually, that's actually more evenly split. And you can see the ones in green are the skim fat orders there, which are, well, maybe except for Arizona, are much more heavily class 1 utilization. And if you look at what the Northeast Class 1 contribution is to utilization, it's the orange line, and to revenue, it's the gray line. So we go from utilization being 44%, it goes up a little bit into the, or 04, 05, 06, and then trends downward pretty significantly. And as far as revenues, right, because Class 1 tends to be the highest price. And so, when you have a high utilization, you have a high price, you're going to contribute a lot to the revenue. And so we go from 50% of the revenue, and it held pretty well up there until 2010 really is when it really starts to drop. But we finished in 2021 at 34% of the revenue. So there's and that's the Class 1 has to participate. That's generally the highest price at farm level in particular. It's structured that way intentionally. That's, the federal milk marketing orders are primarily about servicing the Class 1 market and making certain that the beverage needs are met. And when you have a 1/3 decline in the value and the revenues that are contributed by that, there's just simply less money to go around, and that gets reflected in a couple different ways. But there's just less value there. So if we look at, what's been driving that kind of writ large since we last reformed the federal milk marketing orders, I would argue that, the biggest things that have happened are that exports have gone from, 5% of U.S. Milk production, at least in equivalents, to, 18% today, roughly. So we went from a point where we were basically even as far as the amount of milk equivalents we exported versus imported, although they were different products. And then, since 2005, it's really taken off, and now it's 18% today. And we're still importing about 4 or 5% on milk equivalents in specialty products, but we're a very large net exporter. And what does that mean? That means that we are, in the international markets, that we're basing the bulk commodity product prices off of the international markets. We're competitive. We're at world level. We're not exporting this because we have massive export subsidies. And so that introduces both an outlet for that milk, but also brings back the issues that come with the international price setting overall. The second thing is just changes in consumption patterns. And the third issue would be consolidation in the supply chain, which goes all the way from input suppliers, all the way to the retailers. Then this is just what I was talking about with the export volumes. This is total milk solids, this is percent of production. And it really took off. I said 05, I guess I should have said 04, because before this we're in the 4, 5, 6%. And since then, a little bit of drop in 09, but a pretty steady increase. And again, this is quantity, not value. Value would have a little bit more variation because obviously we've had some good years and bad years. This is a slide you may have seen many times from me because I get tired of reading about how it's the end of dairy as far as American consumers are concerned, and it simply isn't. This is total dairy consumption across all products per capita, and we're talking about a number that just keeps going up, about 3 pounds per person per year in terms of across all products and consumption in at least in fat equivalents. But underlying that, right, is the fact that per capita beverage consumption has been going down for decades. This goes back to 1975. And it's a little bit hard to tell, but there's a kink right here in 2010 when it does get sharper. And if you put that together with what's happened with population, then that's driving the total amount that's going down at the same time. If you look at what's going on with cheese, butter, and yogurt, cheese goes up like clockwork. American consumers are finding new ways all the time to consume cheese, and cheese works with everything, right? Yogurt is on, and butter are on the right-hand axis, cheese is on the left-hand vertical axis. It's a little hard to tell with butter because it's kind of flattish, and these are, but there is a pretty decent increase since 2010, 2008 to 2010 period in butter, in the sense that it's up about 20% per person, and then we've got 338 million people, so it adds up. And then yogurt is the one that kind of jumps off the chart here because after, in the last 20 years, yogurt consumption has, more than doubled. And so you put that all together, we have increasing consumption, but a decreasing amount so we're eating the milk now, eating the dairy products and drinking less of the dairy products. Then when we look at orders like the Northeast order, which is a multiple component order, the producer price differential comes in, and that's where we see the value, right? The producer price differential is the value of the blend price in excess of the class 3 price, right? So we pay for everything at class 3 component values first, then we blend what's left, and that gets paid out as a producer price differential. That's simply an accounting procedure. But what happens is that the producer price differential ends up being negative whenever the class 3 component values exceed the weighted average of the other class components, which has been happening more and more recently in every order. So we see that, in the Northeast order, we've got an average producer price differential over the entire period of $1.65, which is the highest one that's on here. I should note, by the way, that the California numbers that are on here are just since California joined the federal milk marketing order system. So it's only been since 2018. So that's a little bit misleading. And these are the multiple component orders that have producer price differentials. And so you see that the Northeast having a lot more class 1 utilization ends up with the most healthy of the producer price differential that then gets shared across all of the milk in the order. But still, we've had a lot more periods of negative since, well, it says since reform on the bottom, and I should be careful. That reform refers to the change in 2018 when we went from the higher of class 3 and class 4 skim to set the class 1 skim price to the average plus 74 cents. Okay, so, but the point is that we've had more negative prices since then, in the sense that we've just had less pool value in excess of the class 1 and more periods when after paying for everything at the class 3 component prices, there's just nothing else to go around. And so it ends up looking like a deduction on the milk check, as you all know. So that if we look at the Northeast order producer price differential over this entire time, there's a downward trend. Okay, so looking back from 2000 through 2022, the green line is the trend, the blue line is what actually happened. We've got some seasonality in there, which we would expect. You can see when we had some really big turns in value, but if you look back here at the 2004 period when we've got this big negative producer price differential, that was driven by a big cheese price rally, right? So we priced the class 1 prices with a lag because we use advanced prices for the class 1 prices. And if between the time that the advanced prices come out and when the class 3 and 4 prices come out, which are at the beginning of the following month, there's a big increase, particularly in cheese prices, we would get a negative producer price differential. And in fact, that's primarily what used to drive these negative producer price differentials that occurred here in the first decade that we had multiple component pricing. And the story in that was, well, don't worry, you're going to get it back next month, right? So, we surveyed class 3 and class 4, it came back, and we used that to set the class 1 price. Then there was a big rally in cheese prices. That's good news. It didn't show up in this month's check, but it's coming. And if you look at the effect of advanced prices over time, you'll see that they pretty much wash out, which they should. That is not what happened here in the more recent years, particularly around the pandemic, when there were other factors, most notably the big difference between the class 3 and class 4 prices now set off the average plus 74 and not the higher of, and then depooling and a few other factors. And that kind of gets us to where we are today as far as some of the concerns with the federal milk marketing orders. So let's talk about the reform process. You guys can read through this. A lot of you, or maybe all of you, or all know this, but USDA gets a proposal, then they can do something like schedule a hearing, or they can request more information. They can deny the request. If they grant it, then the hearing gets scheduled, and then proponents have a chance to request data. Witnesses have a chance to submit testimony. the public hearing itself is presided over by an administrative law judge. After the hearing gets over, and it may take several weeks, the USDA makes a recording available, and then people that submitted testimony get an opportunity to file corrections for 30 days. They also get a chance to file post-hearing briefs for 2 months. USDA issues a recommended decision within 3 months after getting those briefs. Then they've got 60 days for parties to file comments and exceptions. Then USDA issues a final decision within 60 days. And so these are most of these numbers that I've got up here in terms of months, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days are, they're not overlapping. One follows the other. So you've got it added all up. And after we get through all of this with the final decision and the final comments, then USDA holds a referendum and implements the order of reform, the new amendments that are modified if they get approved. Couple things to remember on this. One is that USDA has to consider all the evidence and comments. My guess is that if we go through this in the near future, and I think it's more likely than not that there will be a lot of comments and a lot of evidence to consider. And another thing is that USDA has a mandate to consider the producer and the consumer effects of any amendment, any changes that they would make to the federal milk marketing orders, right? So the producers get to vote, the consumers don't get to vote. So the producers can signal whether they like this or not through what they do by voting, maybe through their co-op, but still voting. Consumers don't get to. So USDA has a mandate where they need to consider what are going to be the impacts of these changes. And I think that they take that quite seriously, and they should. The amended order gets put to a vote, and it's up or down with the modifications, right? So there's no third option. You see that discussed. But my understanding from a legal standpoint is that because USDA had to consider, for example, the consumer effects, and the consumers didn't get to vote, that the status quo, for example, is simply not something that can be allowed. So you either take the modified orders or you're voting the orders out. And passing takes 2/3 of producers or 2/3 of the milk production. Block voting is allowed by the co-ops, but not required. So that would be up to the co-op. And this whole process takes a year, and maybe significantly longer than that once you add it all up and can consider how long it would be from the time that the process gets started until something was implemented and put into practice. So it's not a fast process. It's a slow and deliberative process. And there's good and bad things about this being slow and deliberative. So let's get a little bit into the proposals. The International Dairy Foods Association and Wisconsin Cheesemakers Association have already put in proposals approximately a month ago, a few weeks ago now. And again, my characterization of those proposals is that they're very much, if not entirely, focused on make allowances, which are the credit that the processor receives from the product price when we're deriving the minimum farm milk prices in under classified pricing in the federal milk marketing orders. These proposals make a very clear argument that it's been a considerable time. In fact, since the manufacturing costs were changed. In fact, it's been since 2008 that they were changed, and that was based on data that was from 2006. And they propose conducting regular audited dairy product cost studies so that the make allowances can be regularly and much more frequently updated to reflect what the cost of production is. The National Milk Producers Federation, right, is my understanding is will be turning in a proposal. I think it's likely to happen this week, before the end of the month. And their proposal contains a lot more issues. They want to return to the higher of for the class 1 mover. At least this is where they were. I guess, let me be careful. I haven't seen the final proposal. Some of these may have changed a little bit, but this is still what's on the website. And I think that it's a reasonable facsimile of what the proposal would look like. Discontinue using the barrel cheese and the protein component price formula. Extend the limit the reporting limit for non-fat dry milk to go from what's sales in the 30-day period to going to 45 days. Update the components factors for protein, other solids, non-fat solids in class 3 and 4 skim milk price formulas. Develop and ensure a make allowance review process and, conduct mandatory studies every 2 years. And then update the dairy product manufacturing allowances based on this kind of information. So let me kind of get into this a little bit, but what the argument that I hear from national milk producers, and again, this is my take on it, is that just doing the make allowances, at least in the short term, is likely to have a detrimental effect on the price paid to farmers. And if you look at it in a more whole sense, then there are things on here that are going to increase farm prices, like potentially moving to the higher of, or updating class 1 differentials, and that will help offset some of the pain that would come through just increasing the make allowances. Because when we say updating the make allowances, it almost certainly means that they're going to get higher, and everything else equal, increasing the make allowances results in a lower farm milk price. And so let me kind of get into some of the stuff behind that. As usual, I have way too many slides, so I apologize. I'll try not to go too fast, right? So let me just talk briefly about the class 1 skim milk price formula, which is where I think that at least probably at the farm level, there would be a lot of agreement that this should something that should be changed. So from January 2000 through May of 2018, the advanced class 1 skim milk price was the higher of the advanced class 3 skim milk price and the class 4 skim milk price. And then through legislation, actually, it was changed to be not the higher of, but the average of class 3 and class 4 skim milk prices plus 74 cents. And the 74 cents was intentionally chosen because that was exactly the difference at that point in time between the higher of the advanced, and the average of the two. And so it was intended to be revenue neutral for farmers, but at the same time, by knowing that it was always going to be 50% class 3 and 50% class 4, when you're pricing the class 1 skim milk price, that allows for the class 1 processors to do risk management. And they had less basis risk because 6 months from now, I'm pricing my class 1 input costs as a class 1 fluid processor. I might have been using class 3, but it turns out when we get to that month that had been 6 months from now, it turns out that class 4 was actually the higher price, and now I've got more basis risk on what I protected. So this alleviates that uncertainty. If you look at how this performs over time, so I've got a counterfactual here, which is the counterfactual before 2018 is the average plus 74 cents because that's not what happened. And the counterfactual since May of 2018 is the higher of because that's not what happened. But if you look at them, they track closely together, in fact, very close together in a lot of months. But one thing that stands out is that by using the higher of, you get higher highs and in general, a little bit lower lows. So, if we're looking at variation, there's actually more variation in the class 1 skim milk price under the higher of than there is. And so if we look at it this way, if we just average it over that, this is through 2022 now, I should point out. So it doesn't contain the last 3 months. The average of the higher of was 981 for skim class 1 skim milk price. The average plus 74 cents, 973. So the higher of actually ends up 8 cents a hundredweight higher over that period on average. But almost all of that increase is driven by what happened in the pandemic here. And that's what I would argue really triggered the strong reactions to it, was how much this class 1 skim milk price was foregone, right? And there have been some programs to do kind of reparations in return for missing that too. The standard deviation is relatively bigger, 317 versus 288, and so the coefficient of variation is going to be higher there. So it is going to be more volatile. If we look at comparing the difference here, so this is the average plus 74 cents minus the higher of, okay? So if this is a positive number, then the average plus 74 cents is better in that month. And if it's a negative number, then the higher of is better, okay? So the more negative it is, the better the higher of would have been. If you look at that difference, you'll see that there's a cap. Whoops. There's a cap here, and the cap is at 74 cents a hundredweight, because the best situation with the average of plus 74 cents, where the producers would benefit the most is when class 3 and class 4 skim, advanced skim, are exactly equal. Then you get that plus 74 cents. Now it turns out they're over this 278-month period, they're exactly equal. I think it's once. There's a lot of times when they're within a couple pennies of each other, but they're exactly equal once. On the other hand, to the extent that they diverge, right? Once they diverge by more than $1.48, you would have been better off with the higher of, right? So at $1.48 difference, it's exactly zero, this difference here. And when it gets above that, then you're better off with the higher of. And you can see that there are periods here, 04, 08, 2011, 2014, and then really the big one, 2020 into 2021, when it would have made a lot of difference. And if you look at kind of when is it within that $1.48 boundary, either above or below, because it doesn't matter if it's above or below, you're better off with the average plus 74 cents. That is 59% of the time, and 41% of the months you're better off with the higher of. So on average, the higher of pays 8 cents more, but as far as frequency, you're a little bit better off with the average plus 74 cents. And of course, if you made that difference different than 74 cents, then that would change the frequency with which you're better off. All right. So which do farmers prefer? Well, the average values are close in the long term. They really are. They're close. But missing out on the very high prices in the good years in the pandemic is missing out on what could have been. The regret that comes from that, psychology and behavioral economics would suggest that that's worse than consistent small gains. That's called loss aversion. And I think that also the desire to make certain that class 1 is more consistently the highest priced use, to make certain that milk keeps flowing that direction. I think there's momentum, to go back to something like that, and that may, I mean, I don't know what will be decided, but at the farm level, and I think at the co-op level, it's reasonably fair to say that is definitely what's preferred. Another thing that may be part of the discussion when we get into it is to change the class 1 pricing service, which hasn't been updated also in quite some time. This is the existing class 1 pricing service. I think that in addition to the cost of producing manufactured dairy products, there's a lot of reason to think that the expense of servicing the class 1 contracts has gone up, right? And I mean, just look at what fuel costs and how much fuel prices have increased. And, when you're hauling whole milk, when you're hauling beverage milk, right, it's mostly water. It's expensive to haul. There's kind of no way to get around hauling it that way. And so servicing those contracts is more expensive. And this is, inadequate class 1 differentials and perhaps transportation credits are among the issues, particularly in the Southeast region of the United States. And kind of addressing that is probably going to be part of the discussion. And then I think the question is going to be, even though it is definitely the case that demand for beverage milk is inelastic, increasing those class 1 differentials, everything else equal, is still going to result in less class 1 quantity demanded, even though it will increase revenues because they are definitely inelastic. And I think that's going to be part of this policy discussion. Then let me get to the make allowances, right? So for many years, we had the Minnesota-Wisconsin price that was the underlying price from which we set the other prices in the milk marketing orders. Then in 1995, we went to the basic formula price, which adjusted the Minnesota-Wisconsin with the bulk commodity prices. And the argument there was that the amount of grade B milk production was getting quite small, that it was not necessarily reflective of what was going on in the broader market. And you can see I've got a table on there that I threw up there that I think is from an Ed Jesse publication. I shouldn't put, but out of USDA a data. You can see how little percent of milk production in Wisconsin and Minnesota, which was obviously the heart of the MW milk price series, how small that had gotten. And then since 2000, we've gone to product pricing, which is we're pulling the farm milk price out of the product, the final product prices or the wholesale product prices. Right. And so in order to do that, you survey what the cheese, the butter, the whey, and the non-fat dry milk prices are. From that, you derive what the component prices are in multiple component orders, right? And then we use those component prices and put them back together into the class prices that then get used to form the pool and pay the farmers. And, you know, farmers obviously actually really get paid on the component prices they sell, but we put it together into class prices because frankly, it's a lot easier way to think about it. So in order to do that, right? So for example, the butterfat component price is derived from the butter price minus what's called the make allowance, which again is the credit for the manufacturing cost of 17 cents a pound roughly, and then times the yield factor. And since we sell 80% butter, you know, the yield factor there is 1.2 pounds of butter from 1 pound of butterfat, because again, with the resulting 80% butter. So we have a similar product price formula for cheese, for dry whey, and for non-fat dry milk. The make allowance itself actually has its origin all the way back in the dairy price support program, where the dairy price support program kind of started with the desired farm support price that they wanted to support and added a manufacturing margin to what they were going to pay for the products that they were purchasing. So that's where it kind of came from. In California's system, using multiple component pricing for many years before the federal milk marketing orders also had the make allowance in there, which was also the source of some great consternation in some of the policy discussions that we had back in the 90s, when the discussions were whether the make allowances that they had and the resulting farm prices they paid were actually competitive and fair across the other ones. And we don't have that discussion anymore because California is not operating their own order. So I'm not going to spend time on that. So here's where we were previously for make allowances. So for the first year after reform is the first column there. Then those got revised for and were they in place for another year and a half or so. And then those were revised from April 2003 to September 2008. And since October 2008, we've been at 20 cents a pound for cheese, about 20 cents a pound for dry whey, 17.15 cents a pound for butter, and about 16.8 cents a pound for non-fat dry milk. And they haven't obviously changed since that period. And so, but of course, costs have changed. You know, maybe not in real terms, but they've definitely changed. But we're not paying real dollars over time. We're paying nominal dollars, right? So the input costs, how they've changed, we can look, one thing we can look at is the Bureau of Labor Statistics manufacturing indices. And they have an indice that is specifically applied to dairy product manufacturing. So here is the BLS indice over that period. You can see I put the red line in there since the last make allowance. And so that would show you kind of how much the costs have increased for dairy products manufacturing over that period. But the BLS index includes everything except invested capital labor. So it would include milk as an input cost. And so one thing you want to do if you're using this dairy product manufacturing index is to pull out the milk cost, because that's the milk costs are driving a large portion of these costs, but that doesn't mean that expenses haven't increased. So energy prices and labor have increased greatly. On the other hand, efficiency and productivity of new plants have also increased. And so if we're going to talk about the make allowances, we might also want to have a discussion about yields. And, you know, we've just think about how much bigger some of the new plants are compared to some of the older plants. And there are distinct, when you look at the cost of production studies over time, one thing that definitely jumps out on the cost of dairy product manufacturing is that there are significant economies of size. So this is the BLS dairy product manufacturing, where I put the milk price in there for comparison, and the milk price is driving 88% of the variation in the product price index over that time. But still, the other costs are definitely increasing, as you can see from that linear trend. So Mark Stevenson updated his cost study. He done one in 2006. He did some updates in 07, but in the 07 one, he's pretty careful to say that the energy cost increases in 07 make the 06 one what he thought was, I think, a better long-term estimate. So if we compare his 06 numbers to his 2021 numbers, you can see, you know, that we've got cheese make allowance at more like 25 cents, dry whey at like 26, butter at 14, and non-fat dry milk at 29. I think one thing that really jumps out at you is the joint cost there between butter and non-fat dry milk, and how much more the non-fat dry milk costs have increased. And I think that that partly has to do with how the energy costs are allocated across butter and non-fat dry milk, which takes more energy as far as the drying, and what the kind of energy costs might have been at the time when that study was done. But I don't want to speak for Mark. But that would something that would need to be looked at as we kind of move forward on this. In California, when they had to make allowances, they were set through a hearing process, but they were related to a survey that the California Department of Food and Agriculture did. There were periodic surveys of the butter, powder, and the cheese plants, which looked at ingredients costs, packaging costs, processing labor, general administrative costs, and plugged in a return on investment in the manufacturing facilities that was at the prime rate of interest that was also included. And so that would be something that might need to be done. If we look at the 2015, 2016, which are the last years for which the California cost studies are available, you can see kind of where the costs were distributed. And then you can think about what has changed as far as costs since in the last 7 years, as far as labor costs have definitely increased. And, you know, some of these other costs. So definitely, and at that point in time, in 2016, we were at, this is cheese. I should have put this in here, 24.5 cents a pound on cheese on average. But one thing that I didn't get into here is that they do divide it up into kind of smaller and larger plants to the extent that they can possible with the amount of responses that they have. And you definitely see that the cost of production in the smaller plants is significantly higher than that on the larger plants. And that is, you know, not just fixed costs, but, you know, efficiencies and other things of that nature. So if we look, the current make allowances are in the first column here. Mark Stevenson's are in the second column. And by the way, this is not the official proposal. These are the last numbers I found. So I certainly don't want to characterize National Milk as proposing these numbers. That was just some numbers that they had out a few months ago. Mark's average numbers are the top number in that column. And then below that is the range. So for example, we had 24.76 cents a pound to manufacture a pound of cheese in make allowance, but it ranged from 14.5 cents a pound to about 38 cents a pound, which is a pretty wide range, right? So when we think about where you put these make allowances, one of the questions is going to be, is the average the right place to put that? And what are the implications of putting it at the average? You know, there's maybe so that's probably the biggest range. Well, they're all pretty big ranges, aren't they? But what does this mean? So if we look at current versus the National Milk proposal, you know, we're talking about changing the class 1 milk price by 92 cents and the other ones by 50 or 60 cents. And you put that all together by the weighted average, and that would be, in the short term, ceteris paribus, meaning everything else equal, what it would mean as far as what it does to the class prices that get paid to farmers. So if we think about what does this then mean? Well, if you think about it from the processor side, if the processor's manufacturing costs are less than the make allowance, well, then it should be, you know, they can pay a higher price for milk with that difference that they have as far as having lower cost than what the make allowance would reflect, or they can, you know, make a profit, or they can do some of each and everybody wins. If, however, the manufacturing costs at the processor are greater than the make allowance, then they're going to either need to make up the difference in the price and their sales margins from, you know, getting a higher price for their, particularly maybe if it's a specialty product, or, you know, other than the class 1 processors are not required to participate in the federal milk marketing orders. So you could depool, and I think we've definitely seen that happening in some situations. Or, you know, the worst case scenario there is kind of cease manufacturing or exit the industry. And so those are kind of what we've been dealing with. And what we're seeing is, you know, on the co-op side, some of this is deducts out of milk checks. And hopefully one thing that would happen if make allowances go up is that, you know, the deducts for manufacturing costs would go down, and that would help offset this, right? The other part that I've mentioned already is that the studies consistently reveal larger plants have lower cost of production. And so, you know, are there systematic differences in age of facility and scale of facility across regions? And what does this mean as far as the implications, not at the national level, but at the regional level? And, you know, the hypothesized kind of effects of the higher make allowance would be that it's going to result in higher returns to processing and lower returns to the farmers in the short term, right? So, because all else equal, it's going to mean a lower farm milk price in the short term. And in the longer term, we're going to hope that because there's a higher return, that the plants want more milk, and that's going to drive up the derived demand for farm milk price. And clearly, right, we need a system that works for all of the players in the supply chain. It's got to work for everybody. And to the extent that it doesn't at the current time, that's certainly a strong argument for doing something about it. And, you know, I think the dynamic updating sense to the sense that we're going to reflect the current or most recent cost of production, we're going to need to have something that's dynamically updated. The National Milk Proposal, at least the last one that I saw, was to update it every 2 years. And, you know, then I think we can have discussions about whether that's the right frequency or what it should be done and how it should be done, and mandating that USDA has not just the mandate to do it, but that they have the resources to get this done right, and required reporting and participation, things of that nature. All right, so the next steps are that the National Milk Producers Federation puts in their hearing request, which again, I think is likely to be by this week, by the end of this week. Then USDA is going to rule on whether to grant a hearing. And importantly, what will the scope of the hearing be? Will the scope be class 1 pricing issues? Will the scope be make allowance issues? Will it be both? You know, and then we're looking at, given the timing of where we're at right now, we're potentially looking at a hearing in August, and that kind of sets off the big set of discussion here. Zach, I might have pushed a little long here, and so I apologize on that. But I'm happy to the extent that you can take a question or two, Zach, and people can stay on.
Yeah.
Thank you. To have a discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Wolf, for your presentation. Very informative. Appreciate your insight on that. We did have one question to come in, and we'll start with that one, but I will remind everyone, if you do have a question, go ahead and type that into the chat, and we'll get that to Dr. Wolf. So the question that came in, sort of a loaded question, Chris, but how do you think is the best way to overhaul the milk pricing issue? What would you do if it was up to you?
Well, you know what? I do think that it's time. I do think that the California system of updating make allowances is probably a good way to go. And I think it's time to look at updating that over time. I do also think that, you know, I would probably go back to the higher of if I was just making a decree. And I also think it's fair to say that it's time to look at the class 1 differentials and ask the question of whether the class 1 markets in particular, because that's really at the heart of what the federal milk marketing orders are about, whether they are being serviced, whether the milk is getting to where it needs to be, particularly when we think about like the southeast part of the United States, and whether the milk is moving that direction. You know, I'm not in the camp of we should do away with federal milk marketing orders. You know, and that's not because I don't think that, you know, milk would not be produced or not find a home. I think it would work. I think if you did away with them, it would be a very, very sharp adjustment in a very short period of time. I think it would accelerate the structural change that's been going on a great deal. And I think there would be distinct winners and losers out of that. So I certainly hope that doesn't happen. I also think that some of the market failure situations that necessitated or motivated the federal milk marketing orders to begin with still exist. I think there are still information issues. I think that the Federal Milk Marketing Orders play a really important role in auditing and certifying and in providing the information for the market participants. And so, yeah, that's all a long way of saying that I probably would need a lot more study, and I'm, working on some things, and I know colleagues are working on some things, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that's coming out and having a discussion about where the right level of that Class 1 differential is and what the trade-offs are in the way we price the Class 1 skim milk price. And, I'm really interested to see, more information on what the distribution and manufacturing cost looks like and what that means, depending on where we set that. I guess, for me as an economist perspective, I'm real curious about whether the average is the right place to put that, or it should be at the 75th percentile, or it should be at the, looking at that over time is something that I'm pretty curious about. But then again, I sit in an office in Ithaca, New York, and I have a little, different set of what I want to see out of this professionally than you ladies and gentlemen do that are living with the implications of it from day to day. The other thing I would say is this: I think that the Federal Milk Marketing Orders work well with the set of institutions that have grown up around them, and that's not surprising over time. But there have been some other countries that have kind of gone what you might call cold turkey and free market on some of their dairy markets, and that has had pretty big implications both in the structure of the industry, but in particular with the long-term viability of some of the institutions that are related to the structure. So.
Thanks, Dr. Wolf. There was another question that came in, or a couple more questions. I know we're over our hour, but appreciating everyone hanging in with us. This is an important topic, so we'll make this the last questions. But recent experience is discounted. If the Farm Bill legislation was the only way to revise, what changes, if any, could be safe to do in that manner? And then the second part of that is obviously go back to higher of, can't updating make allowances be ordered through legislation without damage? Don't set the value, just direct it to be done. What else?
That's a fair question. And let me caveat this by saying that obviously I'm not a lawyer. So I want to be real careful. Clearly, right, in 2018, they changed from the higher of to the average of. So it would make sense that they logically could go back that way. I think that the legislatively, they could probably mandate that USDA do the studies. Even in California, when they did the study wasn't the final number, right? There was still a hearing. California just had a more streamlined hearing process. And maybe there's ways that the hearing process could be streamlined on things of that nature. But that would be a good question for the lawyers. And I think maybe the question that's being asked is trying to get at, geez, I'd hate to wait 12 to 18 months before we can get something like this in place, right? Because it's already been since 2008 to get it done. And I think that's a fair question. And I think asking for ways to be thorough and deliberative, but still make it happen a little faster is completely fair and not unreasonable request.
All right, thanks, Dr. Wolf, and thank you for the questions as well. Again, thank you for everyone for participating today. I would like to mention that for the rest of the year, we're going to try something different on our Protecting Your Profits webinar. Other than these, the PYP webinars I have where I have a guest speaker, there's generally not a whole lot of live participation. So what we thought we'd do for the rest of the year is for those normal monthly PYP webinars is that I will just record that and have that posted probably by the 4th Friday of every month. And then, of course, the quarterly webinars where I have, like today's, where I have a guest speaker, will provide those live in addition to posting it. So if there's any issues with that procedure going forward, please don't hesitate to email me and let me know what your opinion is. So with that, thank you again, and appreciate your time today, and I will look forward to talking with you in the future, and have a good rest of your week.